As the balance of power shifts, relations between the US and China are, as of the making of this video, rapidly approaching a new all-time low. This also affects the entertainment industry, as many companies there have developed strong business ties to China, and none more so than Disney. As it turned out though, China always was a fickle business partner and one that holds all the power. Which is why John Cena had to put out a humiliating apology, in Mandarin no less, for the high crime of referring to Taiwan as a country. That didn't help though. His movie F9 bombed in China regardless, and now audiences in the rest of the world may have a hard time seeing Cena as a tough guy after witnessing his hostage video. That whole ordeal got Hollywood's attention, and especially Disney's attention, as none have more to lose than them. More than anything else, the parks are what sustains Disney, and of the 6 they have, 2 are in Chinese territories. Meaning, if they so choose, the CCP can seize them at a moment's notice, and there is nothing Disney can do about it. Dominant players in the film industry must have seen which way the wind was blowing in advance though, because already on May 21st, weeks before these most recent events, The Hollywood Reporter published an article titled, "From Deal Frenzy to Decoupling, Is the China-Hollywood Romance Officially Over?" In this video, I am joined by writer and producer Kamran Pasha, and together we will break down this article and what has transpired since, to see what the future might hold for the relationship between Hollywood and China. From the artwork, featuring the world's most powerful man in the center, and Biden and Bob Iger to his sides, to the sheer word count, a lot of work went into this epic Hollywood Reporter piece. Now, Kamran, as a former journalist, what do you think is the intention behind an industry trade putting out such a comprehensive article?
Well, we first have to understand what the trades are. And I've said this before on Midnight's Edge, but the trades have historically been a mouthpiece for the power structure of Hollywood. While they sometimes have some independent reporting, it's not its primary purpose. They are a trade magazine, so they're for the industry. And so what the trades do is they put out what the official word of the industry is going to be based on the power structures. The studios not only buy advertising in the trades, they are the source of a lot of information. And so they have a lot of both direct power through paying the trades money with advertising, and indirect power, such as if you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to deny you access to these stars, for this article, and not give you the ability to do interviews and scoops and insights. And so that's the soft power that they use. When an article like this comes out, and a very, very, very extensive article like this, I mean, this is one of the longest pieces I've ever seen in any trade magazine. What it is this is a planned distribution of the new philosophy towards China that has been determined by the studio system. And so what they're doing is they're alerting all of us in the industry, like myself, who works as a writer and filmmaker in the industry. They're alerting all of us that this is going to be the new line moving forward. And the reason they're making it so extensive is that for the last decade, the line that I've heard is that we've got to do things to make China happy, right? We have to cater to the storytelling, make sure there's a Chinese character in there because we want to be able to sell this in China. Or on a more darker side, we actually have to edit this line and remove it because it would be offensive to the Chinese censors. And I know a bit about the Chinese censors because I worked in Beijing, which, I'll talk about in more detail. But I worked in Beijing to develop a television series there based on the show Nikita, which I had worked on as a writer. And so I've experienced the power of Chinese government censorship quite directly. And so we were being told for the last decade that was the official way we were going to interact with China. We were there essentially to service them, to make sure that their money would continue to flow into Hollywood. The very fact that the trades have put out this extensive article means that the powers that be have decided that it is no longer economically in their interest to continue down that path, and they're advising us of the new narrative that we are all supposed to embrace, which is that we are decoupling from China. And so that means we're going to start making projects that don't take Chinese Communist Party politics into account and don't necessarily rely on trying to pander to Chinese audiences by making sure that there is a Chinese character or something that's a cultural reference that they're going to enjoy. An example of some of this we saw was in one of the Transformers movies, where I think a whole half of that movie was set in China, right? And it was like, I was watching the movie and I was like, the first half I was like, okay, I know all these actors, I know what's going on, and there's the Transformers. And suddenly now the next half of the movie we're in China. I don't know any of the actors. I don't know what's happening here. And but it was clearly that second half was a whole separate movie made for the Chinese audience. And now we're being told by the official powers that be through the Hollywood Reporter that that's not how we're going to be doing things moving forward.
Yeah, and I agree. This article is extremely comprehensive about that point, and it breaks down the entire history and the narrative in such a detailed manner that there can be no doubt about it. So let's tear into the article itself and go through some of the highlights. Now, it begins with Marvel's Eternals, a movie that may end up being banned in China for being directed by Chloe Zhao, a Chinese director who has spoken out against China, something Disney tried to cover up by making a smaller publication censor an interview with the filmmaker, as they correctly assumed the CCP would blow a gasket if they found out. Which they did, despite Disney's censorship attempt, so it was to no avail. The purpose of relaying the story, though, is that is indicative of, and I quote from the article, the dense thicket of sensitivities that US media companies must navigate as they attempt to maintain their enormous business interests in China. Meanwhile, Hollywood is facing criticism stateside for bending over backwards to appease the authoritarian regime. The article even points out the double standards. While US companies are increasingly taking principled stands on social issues ranging from voter rights in Georgia to cases of police brutality throughout the country, Hollywood has remained mum when it comes to Chinese human rights issues. Judd Apatow stood out as the exception when he summed up the state of affairs during a September interview on MSNBC. Instead of us doing business with China and that leading to China being more free, what has happened is that China has bought our silence with their money.
Well, first of all, I want to applaud Judd Apatow for saying that, because he said that, as you said, in September, long before this was the official narrative that's beginning to wind out in Hollywood. But, Mr. Apatow is also highly connected. So he was probably getting some sense that this is where the narrative was going to go. And so maybe he felt comfortable beginning to talk about how we have been silenced by China. And, and as I said, I've worked on a show. I developed a show that ended up going on the Chinese equivalent of YouTube, which was a series about a female spy in China. And nothing like that had ever been allowed in the People's Republic of China before, because officially under the Communist Party, there is no spying, because they have such a powerful control of society. So there's no spies in our country. Foreigners can't get in and spy on us, right? Foreign countries don't have that ability. And so we had to actually change the nature of the show. Initially, it was going to be a spy show like Nikita, which was, about Nikita, who's essentially a rogue spy fighting terrorists and government agents from other societies. Now it was this Chinese woman that's essentially fighting corporate espionage, right? Because the United States government couldn't infiltrate China with spies, but maybe Microsoft could. And so we had to change the nature of the show, and every single script had to be reviewed by the Chinese government, and they would say, yeah, you can't say that. They're not going to do that. So, that was pure censorship. Literally, they told us what we could and could not do in order to be able to broadcast it in China. And so I experienced that directly when I was there. And Hollywood, for all of its talk of idealism, has always been about one thing and one thing only, which is money, right? At the end of the day, it says what it says in order to get PR, which is, again, about money. If you can sound morally righteous, then people will come and support your products and watch your movies and watch your television shows. And so that's the goal of it. And so the problem the problem that China presented, at least the Chinese Communist Party presented, was that it was the source of money. At least that was what was being, held up as a carrot, that we're going to be a source of tremendous money for Hollywood, but you're not going to be able to bring morality into the conversation if you want our money, and you're not going to be able to critique our policies. I mean, we had years, we had movies like 7 Years in Tibet and all that, and suddenly all that stopped. Tibet used to be a big, Hollywood political thing. Raise money for Tibet. The Dalai Lama is a celebrity, right? And then suddenly all the free Tibet stuff stopped real fast when China became at least the anticipated source of money. But then the problem, and I think the article goes into it, is that China made one mistake, is that if you're going to blackmail someone, you actually have to follow through with it. So if you're going to use money as the way to leverage power over Hollywood, you actually have to make Hollywood invested in getting that money. But the problem with an authoritarian government like the Chinese Communist Party is that they aren't able to think that way. They're used to just doing, ordering people to do things, and people obey. And so they did not see that all the restrictions they placed on how Hollywood can make money on it would actually sour the relationship, right? It was the Chinese Communist Party's greed and power hunger that took away its ability to actually use Hollywood as a propaganda piece. Because once Hollywood realized, we're not making money on this, then why are we shackled to this? What annoyed Hollywood is, we thought we were going to make billions of dollars off of you, but you're keeping most of the revenue for yourself, both in terms of movies, in terms of like these Disney parks. Well, then what's in it for us? You want us to be your propaganda arm? What are we getting out of it? And that was the mistake the Chinese Communist Party made, is they overplayed their hand and could not consider the actual point of bribery, which is you actually have to pay the money to bribe someone. So here we are.
Exactly, and I think that's a really good point, because in doing business with China, they are the ones that get all the cards, they get the majority of the cash. A foreign company, meaning a non-Chinese company, can't even get entry into China. In order to set up their business in China, like Disney has, they have to create a new local branch, one that is majority owned by a local company. And that company, in part, is effectively owned by the CCP. So every foreign company is part owned or majority owned by the CCP. Of course, then you can wonder, how did this state of affairs come to be in the first place? And the article actually does answer that. The article states, throughout the Obama era, Washington foreign policy consensus held that the best way for the US to avoid dangerous conflict with a rising China was for the two countries to become indispensably integrated economically. The consensus in Hollywood, meanwhile, was similar but slightly different. The best way to get rich was to extend your business into China's burgeoning consumer market as deeply as possible, whether by tapping into the country's overflowing pool of outbound investment capital or by establishing novel ventures that would ostensibly bridge the world's two largest entertainment markets for decades to come. On the Chinese side, Beijing deployed its standard playbook for playing catch-up in a high sophistication industry dominated by the West. Crack opened the door to the local market just wide enough to entice experienced foreign firms to enter into partnerships and joint ventures with local companies, required in many sectors under Chinese law in exchange for market access, with the ultimate aim of facilitating rapid knowledge transfer to the Chinese side while limiting the foreign players' potential dominance. The article then goes on to describe how Hollywood's entry to China really took off in 2012, when then Vice President Biden brokered the deal which gave Hollywood studios slightly more favorable terms, and although the CCP was still calling the shots, they were hoping, I think that's pretty optimistic, that China would decide to give up more when the deal was up for renewal 5 years hence, out of the goodness of their hearts. Do you think this was optimistic, that they would enter a deal hoping that maybe we're going to get some more money 5 years later?
It's more than optimistic. It's delusional. Having worked in China and having experienced how authoritarian that society is, as someone who grew up in America, I mean, I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, and I moved to Los Angeles, and this, well, at least it was until the events of the past year, an incredibly open society, and you take it for granted. And I did not realize how much I took it for granted until I went to work in Beijing. And when I arrived there, the amount of day-to-day control that the government has instituted over that society was incomprehensible to me. The producers that I was working with would pick me up from the hotel we were at every day to bring me into the office, but they could only do that every other day. They would have to send a taxi every other day because, so let's say Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they would pick me up, and Tuesdays, Thursdays, they would send a taxi because they only had a pass that allowed them to drive on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And if they were caught by a police officer driving on Tuesday and Thursday, they would receive a massive fine. That's how controlled the society is. And so the idea that you could appeal, and over good time, the good relationships with the Chinese government, you would appeal to their hearts, and they would start, just changing the economic structures that you've agreed to. No, they're going to once they realize it's working, they're going to put more restrictions on, because that's what they know how to do. This is the inevitable waking up point where this trap probably would have continued for a lot longer period. However, the events of the last year have economically wrecked Hollywood. And there's a reason that this Hollywood Reporter article came out now, right? As after a year of lockdown and economic crisis that has shattered Hollywood. Nobody has time for nonsense anymore. Nobody has time for delusion anymore. Right. And that is why we're seeing changes behind the scenes at places like Lucasfilm and other places. And even though Hollywood is still officially going down the woke narrative, there's quietly behind the scenes changes in how it's approaching storytelling, just because it needs to make money. And they just can't continue down this road with China, because nobody in Hollywood cares if the industry is successful. They only care about their own job. Right. So if the industry is not doing well, but they're doing very well, they don't notice or care about anything that is happening, right? But this past year, the crisis had become so large that even the CEOs of the cocktail party circuit, it began to affect their lives, and it began to affect their sense of power and control over their fiefdoms. And so now, purely out of self-preservation, these overlords of Hollywood are saying we have to jettison this relationship because we just had a stroke and we now have to get back on our feet.
Indeed. So now it's when the damage is acute. However, the damage itself started at a smaller scale earlier. Many think that things really went haywire under Trump. But it actually started before that, towards the very end of the Obama presidency. This is something that they actually talk about in the article, that relations with China took a turn for worse prior to Trump taking office. The first phase of the down cycle for Hollywood and China actually preceded Donald Trump's arrival on the world stage, albeit only briefly. In late 2016, Beijing began hitting the brakes on Chinese companies' pattern of aggressive pursuit of international trophy assets. Concerned over downward pressure on the Chinese currency and alarmed by vast sums Chinese conglomerates like Wanda, Fosun, and others were spending in non-strategic sectors, Chinese regulators abruptly cut off their access to state bank financing for outbound investments, plunging several of the firms into sudden debt crisis. Then came Trump, and the Hollywood Reporter are clearly not fans of his. In the summer of 2018, the president began implementing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of tariffs on Chinese goods, from which there would seemingly be no going back. Although the entertainment sector was spared by Beijing's direct tariff retaliation, Trump's trade war had an immediate effect. Throughout late 2016 and early 2017, the MPAA had been laying the groundwork for the long-planned renegotiation of the US-China Film Trade Agreement, which was set to expire in February of 2017. Sources close to the talks at the time told The Hollywood Reporter that the MPAA had reached a tentative agreement with Chinese officials that further concessions would have to be made. Two major priorities: opening up the Chinese market to a larger number of US film imports and raising US studios' share of revenue closer to international norms, were thought to be within ready reach. But Trump's belligerent rhetoric and aggressive actions on trade instantly subsumed such progress, as sectors of vastly larger national security and economic consequence took precedence. Again, were they optimistic to think that any such deal actually could have been made?
Yeah, I mean, when the Hollywood Reporter claims that there was some hopeful progress that that the Chinese Communist Party was going to increase Hollywood's revenue share, I mean, I think that's just delusional stuff. I mean, again, that's just talk. I actually think, and people know, anyone who follows me on social media knows that while people may assume that I'm very conservative, I have many critiques of Mr. Trump, but I think he did the right thing in standing up to China. And it was a necessary shock to the system. It actually gave Hollywood the very thing that we are at today. Even though Hollywood does not like to credit Mr. Trump for anything, his stance on China led us to the place where this break is now possible. Where people waking up inside the industry that this will never be the economic parity that you want. And the cost of that is a massive PR cost. So Trump gave Hollywood a gift by actually doing what Hollywood did not have the wisdom or the strength to do, which is stand up to the Chinese Communist Party. It allowed Hollywood to finally get to a place where the bean counters could assert themselves and say, boss, this isn't going to work. We can't sustain our share price. Our shareholders are going to get angry and you're going to get fired. We got to make a new track here. So Mr. Trump led us to that, even if Hollywood, out of basically a general animosity, won't acknowledge individual things that he did correctly.
No, indeed. And on that note, the article goes on to the current administration, about which it says, the election of Joe Biden has brought a glimmer of optimism to some quarters of the industry. Many wondered whether the new president's track record of deal-making with Xi on behalf of the movie business might create space for a new film agreement. Perhaps the trade dispute would find a more balanced footing and cultural exchange could be presented as low-hanging fruit. Although Biden's team is attempting to identify narrow areas of clear mutual benefit, such as climate change, where meaningful collaboration might be possible, China's red line issues, such as technology that touches national security, human rights, Taiwan, Hong Kong, or the South China Sea, are expected to remain immovable. At the same time, the Biden administration is in the process of devising and communicating where the United States' red lines lie, meaning the US is flexible and China is not.
One of the problems in any kind of conflict, and the reality is we are in conflict with China. We have been for years. In the form of competition, right? It is a competitor country and a competitor economy that was on the trajectory to be the world's biggest economy, right? And eclipse the US's economic power. The idea that one side has red lines, the other side has flexible lines, that doesn't really work in a conflict. That just means one side's going to win. You have people that are in denial about what the interests of both countries are. And at the end of the day, in order for you to survive in this world, first your house has to work. That's just basic for all of our lives, right? If the United States can't figure out what its red lines are, the whole planet is going to lose. We are the last line against this kind of authoritarianism, and we don't have a choice. And I'm actually glad that Hollywood is waking up to that, even if it's not coming from a moral place. It's coming from a practical place, but that practical place is good enough. It's good enough for us to start establishing our boundaries again, because this country, the United States, and Hollywood, which is still the cultural definer of the world, for better and for worse, and we sold all of that away with our deal with China, and now, not because we care about the Uyghurs or anyone else, but purely because China didn't make us as rich as we wanted to be, and is becoming an economic burden for us, and is now becoming a PR embarrassment. We're breaking free. So maybe we can start using the public relations power of Hollywood to go back to, the 7 years in Tibet, but now it's 7 years in Xinjiang, in the Uyghur world. And let's see that world, because that's the power of this industry. Let's show what the Chinese Communist Party is and how it has betrayed the Chinese people since the 40s.
Those are some very, very good points. And that actually segues really nicely into what the article does next, which is to try to project or predict what kind of movies can still work in China in this new, more tense situation between the two nations. If you have really straightforward, recognizable IP, and the story is well executed, Hollywood tentpoles will continue to do good business here, says James Lee, president of the Beijing-based film market research firm Fun Inc. But on the whole, I think the Hollywood brand has taken a significant hit over the past year. US movies that have a somewhat fussy selling point for the Chinese audience are going to earn a lot less than they have in the past, as the audience has matured and they aren't automatically getting excited about the special effects heavy Hollywood movie. Amid China's speedy recovery from the pandemic and the country's rising global profile, the Chinese audience's enthusiasm is tending to gravitate towards storytelling that encourages pride in Chinese culture and achievement, or nostalgia related to the rapid changes the country has undergone, Lee explains. Marvel tentpoles and Fast and the Furious installments will do just fine, he says, but movies that are more culturally remote or related to Americans' own nostalgia trips could fall flat. And since this article was published, we know that the Fast and the Furious didn't do fine.
The analyst in the Hollywood Reporter, the Beijing-based analyst, is correct in part. It's from my experience. He's correct in that, Hollywood's tentpole movies, Fast and Furious, Transformers, that kind of stuff, will still have a market in China. As we see, Fast and Furious didn't do as well as they wanted it to, but there's still a market there. Where I would suggest there's a subtlety that this analyst is not bringing up. In fact, I haven't heard from anyone the subtlety, but I experienced it directly. There is a kind of Hollywood storytelling that the Chinese still want. And it's a kind of Hollywood storytelling that we, for political reasons, have avoided. When I was working in China on my project, we had a major issue when we were developing, because I mentioned this was a sort of a female a Chinese Nikita, where you had a Chinese woman who is, Nikita was the idea is the woman is a spy and then discovers that the agency she's working for is actually the bad guys, right? And now what does she do? But now who is going to ally with her in the world when the people that employ her are actually the villainous people, and she thought she was doing the good thing and she's not. That was the show that we were developing on the CW. And so we were following a similar path where a Chinese woman is a spy essentially for an internal Chinese agency, and only to discover that the people she's working with are not, working for the interests of the Chinese people, right? And now she has to decide, what is she going to do? How is she going to break free of this agency and stay alive and defeat it, right? So that's a good idea for a show, and it was actually very successful. It on their version of YouTube, iQIYI, I believe it's called, it had over 400 million viewers, right? And so that's pretty good, and so it did very well. But the issue that we had a major problem with in the writer's room. I was supervising several Chinese writers, and we had translators because I don't speak Mandarin and they didn't speak English. But I was able to communicate to them for weeks how to develop the show and make it work, and story and sort of how traditional Hollywood storytelling works. The biggest issue actually was when we started getting to the moment in the show, look, episode 5 of a 10-episode season, where our heroine discovers that her boss is the bad guy. And she's been actually serving the bad guys the whole time and not working for the interests of the Chinese people, right? And then she has, in the story we had laid out, she has a chance to escape the whole system, fake her death essentially, and escape the system and be free of it. And in what I was telling them, what we need to do now in the story is she has this chance, but she realizes the evil plans of her own agency are going to be killing innocent people in China. And so she has to continue to work for them, but now essentially as a double agent. And she's going to risk her own life to save the Chinese people from this evil agency she's working for. Sounds like a pretty standard Hollywood story, right? We ended up having a 12-hour debate. The entire day was spent arguing about this because the producers, who had been trained in the United States, they were Chinese nationals, but they had gone to film school at USC and other American schools. So they were fluent in English, but they were Chinese nationals who had gone to America and gone back. And these were good people, but they said, that's not going to work here. I mean, so what do you mean it's not going to work here? Well, the storyline where this Chinese heroine is going to risk her own life to save innocent people won't work here. I was like, what are you talking about? That's a universal idea. That's what a hero or a heroine is. And what I discovered to my horror was that Chinese culture had been so damaged by what Mao had done and the Cultural Revolution that the idea that a Chinese person would risk their own life for an innocent human being had become incomprehensible to the people I was working with. They're like, well, we Chinese people, we would, literally there were these horrific videos of, a child being run over on the street in Beijing and people just walking by and doing nothing to help the child, right? Who's dying in the street, right? That because the government had so controlled people that, you help that child, you might be liable in some way for the accident. So everyone's like, I'm in it for myself. I'm not going to risk myself for anything. That's what the Communist Party had done to Chinese culture, which isn't the norm of Chinese culture. So I finally said, well, let's look at ancient Chinese writings, ancient storytelling. Was the idea of a hero that sacrifices their life for the good of the people, was that something that was prominent in ancient Chinese literature? And they're like, yes. So that's part of Chinese heritage. It's just something the communists have taken away from you right now, right? And so what came out of it was, this was the reason that the writers and the people that I was talking to watched American movies. They wanted heroism, because they had lost faith in their own sense of heroism, because the Chinese Communist Party had stigmatized heroism. It wasn't to protect other people, right? Because that's the job of the Communist Party, is to protect us. Your job, the heroism was obedience to the state. That's what they had been told for several generations now. And so that's not a human idea. It doesn't come from the heart. It's repulsive, actually, that, a hero is someone that just obeys the government and doesn't care about the innocent lives. That's a repulsive idea. It violates the human heart in any culture, in any religion, in any society, right? And it was clearly upsetting to the Chinese writers I was working with, but they couldn't get over their own programming. That's not how China works. But I finally said, you want the show to succeed, right? So why, instead of that's not how you think the Chinese people are, that they're not the kind of people that would sacrifice their own lives to protect innocent people, give them that. That's why you watch Hollywood movies. And they said, yeah, that's why we watch Hollywood movies. It's to see heroes, because we don't see it around us anymore. And so I said, why don't you give them that? Why don't you make that the storyline of the show? And the show was a massive success in China, and people responded to a Chinese heroine risking her lives for innocent people, because that's the human hunger. So this long thing that I've said here is all about the one thing that Hollywood still has, not because the Chinese Communist Party wants them to have it, but the angle that Hollywood still has is, if it makes universal stories about heroes, about universal human values, the Chinese people will respond to that, right? That they will respond to that, and they will go watch those movies. That's one of the reasons why, in my opinion, the Disney Star Wars failed over there, because those weren't universal values. They were weirdo political ideologies of America that made no sense to people. They barely made sense to people in America. They made no sense to people in China. So they didn't want to go see these movies. But The original Star Wars movies, when they were re-released in China, did very well because it's universal storytelling. And if Hollywood can return to universal storytelling and archetypal storytelling from Aristotle of good and evil and the human condition, that will sell in China. Even if the Chinese Communist Party attempts to stifle it, they will pirate it and people will watch it because that's the human nature. And the Chinese people desperately want heroic storytelling. That's the one thing Hollywood hasn't been giving them.
Certainly, as long as the heroes do not insult the CCP in any way, shape, or form, which regrettably is what John Cena did. During the promotion of Fast and Furious Part 9, incredibly, John Cena made the mistake of referring to Taiwan as a country rather than a Chinese province. And you will recall, Taiwan is one of China's hard lines that they will not budge on. Now, this is more recent. So this is, of course, not something that's addressed in this Hollywood Reporter article, but it is addressed at the insider WDW Pro over at Pirates and Princesses, which states, in order to understand the drop-off, because Fast and the Furious Part 9 kind of bombed after that, despite Cena's groveling apology in Chinese. So in order to understand the drop-off, one must first understand that Chinese moviegoers may have felt concern that going to see the film could have an effect on their social score, a credit score, like means by which the Chinese Communist Party monitors every choice of Chinese citizens and determines their loyalty to the country. If the government isn't happy with Cena or with F9, citizens will likely shy away. How do you respond to that information?
Well, Mr. Cena made a very unfortunate choice of words the second time. I think that, if he had just let it go, calling Taiwan a country, which it actually is, it's just a political myth that Taiwan isn't its own country. It's been its own country since Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fled there, right? And when I worked in Beijing, I met Taiwanese business people. I met people from the Taiwanese entertainment industry that came to Beijing to talk to the people I was working with. And I had tremendous respect and admiration for them. They were sophisticated. It was like dealing with high-level people in Hollywood. They understood the marketplace, and they were just some of the smartest people I'd ever met. And it was clear that the Chinese from mainland China were quite impressed with the Taiwanese and saw them as what could have been for their own country, even if they can't say that out loud, right? So Mr. Cena was not wrong in calling it a country. The correct PR thing to have done was to have said nothing and let it blow over. But, I'm sure he got a call from his agents and probably the producers in the film, maybe there's someone at the studio that said, "Oh my God, you're going to ruin our relationship with China for having said this." And so he does this groveling, shameful, humiliating apology in Mandarin, right? Which nobody respects somebody who humiliates themselves. No, and everyone knows that it's not from a sincere place because everyone knows that this is a myth. The Chinese Communist Party knows that Taiwan is an independent country. The Taiwanese know that. The people of China, mainland China, know that. So when you grovel and say this, it means that you are a slave to a myth that everyone knows isn't true, but they're all going along with it in order to play along, right? And make money. No human being can respect that. So I personally believe that Fast and Furious 9 would have done a great deal better in China had they simply glossed over it and moved on, right? But Mr. Cena is someone that, my understanding is he learned Mandarin on his own years ago because he's an ambitious guy. He wants to be The Rock. He wants to be a top movie star. And this was his big break, to be essentially the villain of Fast 9, which could end up leading to a franchise, right, for himself. And he could end up becoming like The Rock, which is his ambition. And he's a very ambitious guy because he trained himself in Chinese. So he was thinking in those terms. He was like, I'm going to be strategic. Hollywood caters to China, so I'm going to be the only actor, white American actor, that's going to learn Mandarin so I can get those people happy. So this guy's been on a game for a long time, right? And it blew up in his face because for the thing that I said earlier, which is that at the end of the day, people want universal storytelling. They also recognize universal traits, and they recognize that this was a groveling, shameful humiliation of a weak man, right? No one respects that. The Chinese don't respect weakness, right? They don't. And while they may have not liked Mr. Trump, I'm pretty sure they respected him, right? I know for a fact they don't respect Mr. Biden, right? And they think he's a joke. And so Mr. Sena has put himself in that position. And so whatever years of effort that he put himself learning Mandarin and thinking that he was going to become like the white Bruce Lee in China, right? That's done for him. And that's done for him not because he had a slip of the tongue saying the obvious truth that Taiwan is a country and being nice to the Taiwanese people. It was because he did the shameful, groveling, self-degrading thing. And he did it. The tragedy of it is that he didn't need to do it because this article was essentially saying this period is over. He and whoever told Mr. Sena to do this is part of the old wave that's finishing. And the Howard Report article is that period is over, but not everyone got the message, right? And so here we are. Mr. Sena has damaged not only the Fast and Furious franchise in China by groveling, he's damaged his own standing in China and in Hollywood because he's become a joke here. And it's well earned. He did this to himself instead of having the backbone of Ms. Gina Carano, right? Whose fan base has exploded to her side because she stands for some kind of moral integrity and she stands for truth and honesty. And Mr. Sena has revealed himself to be just another Hollywood, poser. And nobody respects that. The Chinese don't respect it. The Americans don't respect it. So he's lost everything in the process of not having the courage to simply say, why don't we just move on from this? People are going to forget about it. Let's focus on the movie. That's what he should have said. But, he doesn't have the strength of character. He just wants to be famous and he wants adulation, which is the downfall of most people in Hollywood, which is everyone just wants to be liked here. And I have let go of that. I wanted to be liked early in my career, and I tried to get along with the things even when I didn't like what was happening. And I discovered people didn't like me anyway. Right? They didn't like me anyway. And they could sense that I was kowtowing or groveling and going along with things I didn't believe in, which they all were doing, but they didn't respect me and they didn't respect themselves. Right? It was when I finally decided, I'm just gonna be honest, that my career both had many crises. I got fired from different projects when I stood up for myself and was honest. And at the same time, I had massive successes. And so I will never go back to that fraudulent obsequiousness that Mr. Sena has shown, because it doesn't actually help your career. Whatever success I've had is because of my integrity, and whatever success Gina Carano is going to have is because of her integrity.
Also on the note of John Cena, because right now it's Fast and the Furious Part 9 that's coming, but in a few months there's The Suicide Squad. And also in conjunction with that, he has his own spin-off series for HBO Max. How do you think those are going to fare now when he has, shall we say, that his stock has depreciated considerably in the eyes of the public?
Well, I hope the Suicide Squad does well for its own sake, because I'm a huge fan of Margot Robbie's interpretation of Harley Quinn. That's why I was a little shocked by the direction they took Birds of Prey in, but okay. But now they're trying to bring that back in the Suicide Squad. So I hope the movie is successful on its own, because most people are going to go see it for the director, Mr. Gunn, and they're going to go see it for Ms. Robbie, right? They're not going to go see it for Mr. Sena. They don't care about him. And now he's blown his wad in Hollywood. I don't know that any of his franchise building efforts is going to work now, because he's become a joke. He's become a wrestler. I mean, you see all the memes that are floating around on social media. The Babylon Bee is doing jokes about him as he has experimental, spinal replacement therapy, right? I mean, he's become an archetypal joke, and he did it to himself, right? And so I think this gentleman that was poised to become, I don't think he'd ever be a star, but poised to become, a working actor, consistent working actor, has ruined that for himself. So I just don't think that that's going to go anywhere for him.
Speaking of going anywhere, what of the future relationship between Hollywood and China? We have this article. We have increasingly colder political climate between the US and China. Where do you think things will go from here?
Well, I think what we're going to see, which is surprising for people today, but I'm going to put on my seer and augur cap, right? I've been called the augur by some people on Midnight's Edge, but yeah, I'm going to give you my prophecy, which is that within a few years, let's say about 2 years, within 2 years, let's say, Hollywood is going to realize that the Chinese Communist Party is their adversary. It was never their friend. It was never going to be there to help them. And then the Chinese Communist Party is going to become the villain in movies again. And you'll see that, and that'll come, something pivotal will happen in the next 2 years, such as they will take control of Disney's park. Something's going to happen where the CCP is going to overplay its hand and do something that Hollywood is going to want revenge for. And that's when the CCP will become the villain again, as it was in the 7 Days of Tibet and other times, right? It's coming. It's hard to imagine that after kowtowing to China for a decade, that the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people, the Chinese Communist Party will become the adversary again. But the events that are happening in the United States, with the revelations of the origins of some of the medical issues that we are facing, it's going to get worse. And as the American people blame the events of 2020 and 2021 on the Chinese Communist Party, they're going to be seen as an adversary by the American people. And Hollywood, once it feels betrayed, once CCP overplays its hand in some fashion, which is coming, then Hollywood will get on board. And you're going to go back to some sort of 80s jingoistic movies of Americans fighting the evil communists. It's hard to imagine that coming after watching the John Cenas of the world, but I absolutely believe it's coming. And it will be a good thing, because the Chinese Communist Party is the villain of the story and needs to be seen by that, by those of us in our industry who are promoting global narratives. And it proved to be its own enemy due to its own arrogance, which is part of authoritarianism. You become blinded to the actual board that you're on because you assume that every piece is going to move the way you want it to, right? And so that's what's coming.
All right, fantastic. That was a great prediction to end it on. So, Kamran Pasha, thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's always wonderful to be on Midnight's Edge. Thank you, Andre.